The establishment of an adequate county park system will require a spirit of cooperation that rises above sectional interests that divide the metropolitan population of nearly 2 million people into many different political entities, and that must work together for ultimate success. For the question of parks today is essentially the same as that faced by Charles Loring and his commissioners 80 years ago. Only the dimensions are different. The automobile brings even the most remote areas close in terms of time. So the entire county, cities, villages, and rural areas must be considered in any county park plan. The parks themselves must be vastly larger. The small, beautifully landscaped parks of the city are still necessary, but entirely inadequate for the recreational needs of a great metropolitan district. The park of today should encompass perhaps 1,000 acres. Except for planned recreational areas, most of the land will be preserved in its original state, where nature in all its forms will exist as a living museum. Where perhaps a giant moth struggling from its cocoon will unfold a wonder of life before a child's eyes.
Welcome to The Wandering Naturalist, a Three Rivers Park District podcast.
I'm Angela, a wildlife biologist at Three Rivers Park District.
And I'm Brandon, an interpretive naturalist for Three Rivers Park District.
Three Rivers Park District manages over 27,000 acres of parklands in suburban Hennepin County and surrounding areas.
Join us as we wander from park to park and discuss the stories of the past, the nature in our present, and how these have shaped our parks.
Come explore with us, The Wandering Naturalist. As you heard in the opening clips, over 50 years ago, the Twin Cities were being developed rapidly. During that time of expansion, a few people had the foresight to protect areas of land so that people in the Twin Cities would be able to enjoy the nature that was quickly being converted to suburbs. This year, 2019, marks the 50th anniversary of two milestones that allow us to tell the story of Three Rivers Park District. The creation of Lowry Nature Center, the first public nature center in the Twin Cities, and the creation of Prairie at Crow-Hassan Park Reserve.
Yeah, so I'm really excited for this, Angela. It's going to be a lot of fun to talk to because we're trying to celebrate the past 50 years. And so there's a lot of history to talk about in 50 years, and we wanted to make sure we were doing it justice. So we're going to have a couple of extra episodes this month so we can really go in depth about how the Park District, why it was created, how environmental education was really baked into it from the beginning. So we have a lot of guests that we're going to interview right now. We're going to talk to our park historian, Bill Walker, and he's going to talk to us about, why was Three Rivers created. We're going to talk to our former associate superintendent about how environmental education was baked into the Park District from the very beginning. John Moriarty is going to be back on our podcast to talk to us about the challenges of creating the Prairie 50 years ago. It was something that really had hardly been done. And so I'm excited to talk about that. And then we're going to talk to staff Kirk Mona from Lowry Nature Center about how they are continuing on that legacy of the past 50 years and how they're doing environmental education. And they're promoting our mission of promoting environmental stewardship. So I think it should be pretty fun as we cover all of these things, talk about a history of an organization that I really respect and enjoy working for. And so I'm excited for us to do it and for our guests to come wander with us as we explore how Three Rivers has worked to make our parks a home for people in the Twin Cities and for wildlife over these past 50 plus years.
Our first interview to kick this celebration off is someone who makes it his job to track the history of our parks. Most do not think past, hey, I enjoy that one park or that one trail. I mean, this just happened to me the other day. Someone was like, oh, yeah, I know those parks. I love them. I was like, oh, yeah, which one do you go to? Afton? No, that's not our park. So there's more to us. And so this special podcast is going to dig deeper into that. And so we are starting with our history of how the parks formed. You got to have some history here. So here to give us more details on who, what, and why of Three Rivers is Bill Walker, our Cultural Resources Manager to Three Rivers Park District. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks.
So can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do here at Three Rivers?
Yeah, so my title is Cultural Resources Program Manager, and outside of the park world, no one would have any idea what that is. So I'm just sort of the resident history person. I have a degree in history. My background is in history. I used to be a park ranger for the national parks before I came here.
Go NPS.
That's right. There you go. So I just enjoy the stories of place. Everywhere has a story. It doesn't have to be these big monumental historic sites. Every piece of land has a story, and our parks are fantastic examples of that.
We met a little bit before we did this podcast so Angela and I could understand the history a little better. And you were telling us that the idea for creating parks around the Twin Cities is actually kind of an old idea. It's from the 1800s. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how the movement to establish our parks finally came to fruition in 1957? I mean, that's a huge span of time to try to work towards something.
Yeah, I don't know if it's evidence of like indecisiveness or...
I think it's persistence.
There you go.
People had this great idea and they were just going to keep fighting until they got it.
Yeah, so fairly early on, the city of Minneapolis establishes its park board, and the city of Minneapolis is purposefully developing around the idea of parks and green space.
And when would this have been about?
So this is in the middle part of the late 19th century.
Okay.
I'm going to use circa, which is sort
Circa.
of the safe word for historians that don't remember their date exactly.
There we go.
And
I'm going to start using that a lot more.
This is proof that when you're in high school, don't focus on names and dates because that's the stuff that makes history boring.
So we can just tell my high schoolers to write circa on their history papers.
Totally appropriate. You get a
Okay.
PhD with circa.
Okay, perfect.
We're going to have some history teachers calling us, aren't we?
So middle late 19th century, the Minneapolis Park Board is formed, and they're establishing parks all throughout the city. And by the 1880s, there's already conversations that these city parks are great, but what would really be cool is if we developed some larger ring parks, kind of on the outside, on the fringes of the city. And this was a popular movement all over the place. Cities like Boston, where they're developing the Emerald Necklace. This is the Frederick Law Olmsted golden years of landscape design. And so Minneapolis gets on board, and they like the idea of these outer ring, more natural parks, something to get the urban folks out of the city. Remember, in the 19th century, cities are pretty gross and disgusting, right? So we're all burning
coal dust
coal
everywhere.
Yeah.
It's there. You smell the slaughterhouses.
Oh,
It's-
entirely, yeah. And then
the waste is in the street.
you've got a city like Minneapolis that's built up around the river, and all the more. I mean, we think of rivers as these pure, wonderful things today. In the 19th century, they were workhorses, and you just dump stuff into the river. So, in general, you wanted to get out of the city and get away from all of that. And so the idea of these bigger parks kind of on the fringe was a really popular idea in cities all across the country. Minneapolis is just one of those places.
So what did a city park look like in Minneapolis during that time? The same as what city parks look like now? Or
It depends. Yeah, it's a pretty good mix. I mean, if you go around Minneapolis, you'll get a fair idea of the variety of parks that they have. There's a great book that the Park Board published, maybe 10, 12 years ago on the history of their park system. And you can kind of watch the different things that they explore. But city parks can range from, little postage stamps of land that have a monument in them to baseball fields, soccer fields, trails, all sorts of things. But not generally these big nature parks. You'll see things like Prospect Park, in Brooklyn or Como Park in St. Paul. Those are sort of the classic Olmsted larger parks. But even those are still fairly developed. They're not big nature areas that you walk around in and experience nature.
So then in the late 1880s, we started establishing these small parks around Minneapolis with the Minneapolis Park Board. We had this idea for larger parks on the fringes like Three Rivers eventually became, but that ended up not happening. And it wasn't until Theodore Wirth, I think you told me, that this idea kind of came about again?
Yes. So Theodore Wirth, a big name in Parks and Rec, had been hired by the Minneapolis Park Board. Theodore Wirth Park is named after him. He had really bought into this idea of larger nature-based parks on the fringe of the city. And in his last act prior to retirement, or one of his last acts before retirement.
And that was like 20s, 30s?
This is 30s, mid-late 30s.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say 37 is the date that sticks out, but again, I'm going to use circa as my safety net.
Okay.
Circa 1937, Theodore Wirth is retiring. And his last big project is to put together a map that sort of conceptualizes what a larger park system on the fringe of the city would look like. And what's fascinating about that map is we have a copy of it in our archives. And if you look at it, you can see the foreshadow of what our park system looks like today.
Really?
Yeah, there are parks kind of sort of roughly where our parks really are. So we definitely use that as a planning document very early on when the concept for the Three Rivers Park system was coming about. I think it's fascinating.
That's amazing. We should get a copy, like a picture of it, and put it on our
we can
Facebook
post
page.
it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
But again, he develops this map, he develops the plan, he puts it on his desk, and he retires. He walks away. And there just wasn't the money or the political will to pull off this idea.
Well, it was in the 30s, so not the right time.
Not the right time. There's a depression, then World War II. There's a war on. We're not going to be spending time and effort developing these parks. And so, again, the idea kind of goes into hibernation for a bit. And what really kicks it off, the thing that really provides the political push for the eventual development of what becomes Three Rivers Park District, is the post-war suburban boom. So World War II is over, 1945, GIs start coming back. There's a terrific housing shortage. Guys are living in old Quonset huts that are built for, these things look like big military hangars. And you'd have multiple families living in these. Significant housing shortage for all these returning veterans.
I would imagine because it's mostly farms.
Well, it's farms on the fringe of the city. And then, there was the Depression and the war. So you've got a good 10 plus year period where home construction just wasn't on the radar.
This is really the first time since the 20s that people had money again.
Yeah, in a significant way. There's pockets of individuals that are doing just fine through the Depression. And so you'll find houses that are built in the 30s.
But it's the general middle class now
but
is
yeah,
when
there
it's
is
really coming to fruition.
Yep. So and that's the story, right? That's the golden age of the suburbs. As there's the GIs are returning. Because of industrialization for the war, we're now booming in commercial production. We're building cars and refrigerators and all these wonderful things. And
it helps that Europe isn't building anything, and so we have a huge marketplace over there to send products to.
And a lot of people who really liked us after the war. So after World War II, we've got this big housing problem and enter the suburbs. Places like Richfield, which is where I live, completely explode overnight. So from 1945 to 1955, Richfield goes from a collection of family farms, small family farms that are producing edibles, lettuce, tomatoes, that kind of thing that they ship into the city. And, cows, cattle, farm areas. In that 10-year period, it went from these little market farms to all of the developable land is developed. By 1960-ish, which is another version of circa, there's literally no land left in Richfield for development. And that's true in other places as well. St. Louis Park completely takes off. All the inner ring suburbs, Hopkins, places like the Brooklyn Center, things like that. These inner ring suburbs are completely exploding. And that's kind of the aha moment, because people start to realize that if we don't figure out a way to get land now for these big parks kind of on the fringe of the city, we're never going to do it.
It's going to be gone. It's
Yeah.
going to be developed.
Property values are shooting up because everybody wants the next house in the next subdivision. And, the little boxes made of ticky-tacky from the songs, those are exploding everywhere. We have all of our own little Levitt towns. And that creates the will. It's the aha moment of this is it. If we don't do it now, it's never going to happen.
So people realize that we're quickly losing land that we could set aside. Mm-hmm. There's kind of this can-do attitude because we just won the war. Mm-hmm. We're America. We're going to take things on. We're going to get this thing accomplished. Mm-hmm. And then there's just the fact that people they need their houses and they realize, all this land's getting taken up. I could kind of see where that takes effect because you mentioned Richfield. They have Wood Lake Nature Center there, and I used to work there, and it's a beautiful park, but it's only about 150 acres. Mm-hmm. And you compare that to Elm Creek Park Reserve, the largest park reserve in Three Rivers Park District, and that, if you include the surface area of the water, that's close to 5,200 acres. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that shows the availability of the land. And Richfield, which had been developed, you had about 150 acres compared to you go farther out towards Maple Grove, what's now Maple Grove Dayton, you had 5,200 acres.
Mm-hmm. So if you're ever wondering why Three Rivers doesn't have a park in your neighborhood if you live in the inner ring suburbs, that's why. It took the explosion of those inner ring suburbs to create the political will that would then come together behind this idea of developing parks. So as a result, there is no big Three Rivers park presence in Richfield, St. Louis Park, things like that. We have trails that go through there. But large tracts of land that could be reverted to forest just wasn't there because they boomed so quickly. It was a 10-year explosion.
That's amazing.
And Richfield's completely covered with Cape Cods and ramblers.
I never think about this, but it really sounds like it's almost this worldwide connection of events that brought this about.
Oh, very much so.
It's the markets in Europe after World War II, the GIs coming back, the creation of the middle class. This is all what kind of drove the creation of Three Rivers.
Which is kind of fascinating when you stop
That
and think
is.
about it. An idea that spawns in the 1880s. Hey, geez, wouldn't it be nice if we had some big parks around the fringe of the city? It took these huge global events to transpire, to create the aha moment.
I don't think about that when I think about my county park district, but
No,
that's amazing.
The fascinating thing about history is we are always more connected than you think. You think the 6 degrees to Kevin Bacon is fascinating. History is always connected in less than 6 degrees. So here this little, regional park system connected to these huge stories of World War II and returning GIs and suburbanization.
That's amazing. So you said the political will finally was able to kind of come about. The resources were there to create Three Rivers Park District, which at the time was Hennepin County Park Reserve, I think was its first name.
Oh man, I'd have to double check.
Yeah,
'Cause we go through
we've
like
had
4 or
several
5
names.
different
Wasn't it just
iterations.
Hennepin Parks?
You're right. I think it was Hennepin Parks.
Just Hennepin Parks.
So we
That
should
was more
probably
recent. We were the Hennepin County Park Reserve District. We were the suburban Hennepin County Park Reserve District. The Hennepin Parks was, I think, the more
80s?
recent lingo.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
late
because
80s.
you'll see more brochures and things that say Hennepin Parks because that was fairly recent.
So something
So-
Hennepin.
Yes.
I think just for clarity, we're going to keep referring to us as Three Rivers Park District because that's what we call ourselves now. But when we're saying that, we're kind of including all those past names. So when Three Rivers Park District was created, then who were some of the people that helped push this through politically and financially?
So I'm laughing a little because this is where I should have boned up a little bit more.
Quiz time.
I'm going to put you on the spot.
No stress.
No stress.
There's a couple of key figures that pop out, but it is a movement. I don't think it would be accurate to say that there's one or even 2 people that are the fathers, mothers, whatever of the Three Rivers Park District. There are community movements, and there are movements among politicians. There's movements among land developers, and there's a couple of key people that stick out, like Baker. So Baker Park is named after, I'm going to forget his first name. I think it's William Baker, but I could be wrong.
William Baker.
So-
I know that because that's my brother's name.
Oh, there you go.
And Baker was the first land that we acquired.
Yeah, Baker's our Yellowstone. Like, if you want to go to the beginning of Three Rivers Park District, Baker is where you go. It's our first park. And that land actually gets set aside before we even exist as a government entity.
So it's exactly like Yellowstone.
It's very much like Yellowstone. Exactly, yeah. Luckily, it only took us, less than 10 years to develop the service that would run the parks. The Park Service, it took like 30, 40 years. But Baker's our first park. It was a hotel, sort of. It was one of the resorts on Lake Independence. Lake Independence was considered the sort of lake that one might summer at. It used to be that summer was a verb, and if you lived in the city, you would summer somewhere outside the city
Yeah,
if
you're
you had the
leaving.
means to do so. Yeah, you would get up and leave. So you didn't just take a week off and go to the woods. You would summer if you were of the upper middle class and higher, and you had the means to do that. And Maple Hill Farm was the name of the resort. It's run by a guy named Sandine. And that land was bought up by Baker for development. And then over the course of a number of conversations, it was decided that, geez, this would be a fantastic place to establish this park system. If we're talking about these big parks on the fringe, we've got this chunk of land on Lake Independence, really pretty stretch of property, arguably one of the better swimming beaches. And so that becomes the first piece of property, and we acquire that, or it is acquired for park purposes, even before the park district exists politically. I want to say that's like 54, 55, and we don't, there's some legislation that's passed in 55, but we don't officially come around until 1957.
So then when we had these first parklands, what were people originally using them for?
Picnicking.
Okay.
It was one of the things that you did if you bought your Cape Cod in the suburbs is on Saturday or Sunday, you'd hop in the big station wagon and you'd bring the family out to a big park and you'd picnic.
And when we say park now, I'm picturing forests and prairies and lakes, but these were actually farmland that we were mostly buying.
That's true.
There was some forests on some of them that had been, set aside because it was floodplains or something like that, but for the most part it was farmland. But eventually the park district decided that they were going to recreate the natural habitat, correct?
Yes, which is another fascinating thing about our parks that I think most people don't know. And again, having worked for the national parks, our story was always places like Yellowstone or Yosemite. How fantastic that someone had the foresight to set this land aside before it was sullied by human hands. This is primeval nature, which of course we all kind of know isn't true because American Indian people have been living on those lands for thousands of years. So it's still changed. It's not virgin nature. But that's the story.
Right.
That's not at all our story. Our parks are fascinating because they were all something else before they were parks. They were people's farms. They were people's homes. They were estates. Norenberg Gardens is the summer estate on Lake Minnetonka of Frederick Norenberg, the guy that brought you Grain Belt beer, which is a fascinating story. And it's this cool, fully intact Gilded Age estate. All we're missing is his home. The Glen Lake Practice Center for golf used to be the Hennepin County Sanitarium. If you had tuberculosis, you'd be sent to this huge hospital that used to be there. Yeah, the hospital's gone, but that's the story of the property.
That's amazing.
Richardson Nature Center was somebody's house. You go to the back part of Richardson Nature Center where you can look out by the bird feeders, and you're sitting in what at one point in time was somebody's 1950-something home. So all of our parks are these lived-in chained spaces. We can't at all make the pretension that these are the forest primeval.
So we've worked hard to kind of bring back what we thought it used to be. How do we make a decision about this goes here, this goes there? How do we know? Was there a map or something that said what it was?
This is also a fascinating story. Way back, before non-Indian settlement was even allowed in Minnesota, the federal government owned the land. And so we bought most of our parks are on land that was part of the Louisiana Purchase, which is kind of a fun thing to think about because everybody talks about that in high school. So most of our parks are west of the Mississippi River, with the exception of Silverwood. Silverwood's kind of an outlier. But and so they're part of the Louisiana Purchase. We buy that from France in like 1804, circa.
That should be our nature word of the day.
I was just going to say, we don't have a nature word of the podcast. A historical word of the podcast
I think it's going to be circa.
Use it.
The mystery word today is circa. Anyway, so we buy this land from France, and it's just land. It's not real estate. We have to survey it for nature to become a commodity, to make it saleable. And that's how our country funded itself for, its first 100+ years. Nowadays we pay income taxes, and a lot of the money for the federal government comes from that. Back then, the land base that we had was what paid the bills. So we had all this land, and you had to survey it. And so teams of surveyors would literally walk across the country and take nature and cut it up into little graph paper bits. And what's really cool is if you look at Google Maps and you put the aerial image as the background, if you go from western Pennsylvania into Ohio, you can see the transition. It's this huge natural resources story that, again, I don't think we talk about. And it's this neat history nature thing. But if you look at it at Google Maps, go check it out on your computer. If you scroll from western Pennsylvania into Ohio, you go from these kind of ragtaggy patches of land that aren't, set up in square and grid. And then suddenly it's like snap, someone's rolled this huge piece of graph paper across the country. And that's how we commodify nature. And we don't We don't care that there are lakes and rivers and mountains. It's just one big piece of graph paper that gets rolled over. Well, it's a couple of pieces. But we commodify nature. And so as the survey crews are making those maps, they're also taking notes. So this land is heavily forested with deciduous trees. This land has prairies. This land has potential mining features, yada, yada, yada.
Did they get more specific than that? Did they actually list what trees are present?
They do. This is a maple forest. This is a pine forest. And they go into greater detail than that, but truthfully, I'm the wrong guy in the park district to ask about that. I'm the pigeons or not pigeons bird guy.
Okay.
So human history is my thing. But anyway, they do. They get into fair specifics for what's on the land. And that helps sell the land, too, because a lot of times people were buying land completely sight unseen. You'd buy it from an office in Washington, D.C. and never come to Minnesota. You'd buy it as a speculator. You'd try to flip the property, just like people were flipping houses 10, 15 years ago. And so all those notes exist, and they're still available. And if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, the Bureau of Land Management's website has all of that information, and you can download it for free. You can download high-resolution scans of these original survey maps, which are just beautiful and fascinating for their 19th century calligraphy, if nothing else. But you can kind of get a feel for what people saw when they first looked over the land and converted nature into something saleable, into a commodity. And so all those notes exist and all those maps exist. And in Minnesota, there was a guy named Marshner. And I want to say his first name was James, but I could be confusing him with James Michener, the author. So we'll just use his last name, Marshner. And this is before GIS, right? So nowadays you can develop these super detailed maps in an afternoon by plugging in data and a GIS program will spit out these beautiful maps. So this is before that. So this guy spent the better part of his career looking over the notes of the Minnesota survey maps and then kind of plotting those out on a modern map of Minnesota. And so there exists, and this is another thing you can Google, the Marshner map. And this map shows you the original land cover of all of the state of Minnesota. And it's all color-coded. And again, it's a beautiful map to hang on your wall, but it's also chock full of really cool information. Light yellow is prairie and dark green is coniferous forest. And he's got he's got a lot of different land classifications. And that map, this may be a long answer to your question, sorry. That map, the Marshner map, is what our natural resources folks used to get a feel for what the land would have looked like before settlement, before all these white folks started showing up. What did the land look like? This is what we think it looked like.
Do you still use that Marshner map, Angela? Do you still have it in your office?
I've seen it. Yeah, it definitely exists. I know what it is, but no, I don't think we use it much anymore. We've, with GIS advancements, which I use almost every day, we have gotten a lot more detailed.
So this was the seed that led to what you are using
Yeah, but it's definitely
now.
the base and foundation of how, both forestry and wildlife get together and make plans for what's going to be open, what's going to be forested. And that's the kind of, all predetermined for the park so that we have a plan of what's going to be where for restoration purposes.
It's amazing. So I just find this fascinating how all of these huge things have really come together to shape our park district. We have people in the late 1800s saying we should have land like this, and then, it gets delayed, and then issues like the Great Depression and World War II, these major events in our history impact when it happens. And then, the recovery markets in Europe and our industrialization help drive an era of prosperity that allows us to finally create these park
Puts
districts.
the pressure on. It has to happen now.
And then the Louisiana Purchase and these surveyors going through and identifying these things is what is influencing how we decide how we're going to restore the natural landscape that was here pre-European settlement into our parks. That's amazing, all those connections. It's a lot of history. That
and you never thought, a lot of times people, so I'm a transplant, right? I'm not from Minnesota. But I've talked to my nieces and all who are, Minnesota born kids. And I think a lot of times we don't think that Minnesota is connected to a lot of these bigger stories in national history. What's Thomas Jefferson got to do with Minnesota? Well, everything, because that's
Louisiana
the Louisiana
Purchase.
Purchase story and the Public
Yeah.
Land Survey. He was a huge advocate for that. So we have all of these really interesting, intricate connections, and that's the fun of my job is piecing together the story from all of these different angles.
Well, thanks for coming on today and sharing some of these pieces and how they tie together to create our park district. That was, I found that very fascinating. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be having you on for some future podcasts because there's so much more we could go into. But again, we need to get to Lowry, and the prairie is the true 50th anniversary subject of our podcast.
So our next episode, we'll be talking to Tom McDowell. He is the former associate superintendent of Three Rivers Park District, and he's going to talk to us about how environmental education has really been part of the park district since the very beginning. So I look forward to talking to him about that because as an environmental educator, it's something that's near and dear to my heart.
And we'd like to extend an invitation for all of you to join us on Saturday, September 21st for the 50th anniversary of the restored planted prairies at Crow-Hassan Park Reserve. There will be horse-drawn wagon rides and so much more to celebrate 50 years of prairie restoration efforts. Brandon and I will be present at the event and leading our very own A Wandering Naturalist hike through the prairies. So again, make sure to visit threeriversparks.org for more details, and you will need to register, and we look forward to seeing you there.